It is important to have a deeper understanding of the necessary processes for the culture of the future to be the future of work. And we all know that future of work is a topic which many people are now talking about. Is it work from anywhere? Is it work from home? Are we getting back to so-called the new normal? Many people are very insecure about how the future will look like and what the culture changes will be. And I have an expert here with me right today. Rael Bricker holds 2 master's degrees in MBA and MSc in software engineering and an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. Rael is currently a fellow of the MFAA, that's the Mortgage and Finance Association of Australia, and he's a certified speaking professional of the Australian Speaking Association. The professional speakers in Australia have the strictest rules on this planet to give the CSP away. In other countries, it's a bit easier, but in Australia, they are very strict with that. And he's a member of the AICD, the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Additionally, Rael is the first inspirationalist in Australia with Integris Global and a mentor with both mentored with Mark Boris and Mastermind Space. Rael is also the author of Dive In, Lessons Learned Since Business School. Hello and welcome, Rael Bricker.
Hi, Niels, and thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you very much for taking the time. We're getting straight into it. One thing you mentioned on your website, which really worked well with me, is you say that Dive In, your book, looks at 30 plus years of work and business on 2 continents, from startups to listed companies. It's a collection of business principles that underlie the idea of sometimes just taking a leap of faith and diving in, understanding the opportunities and challenges of businesses and embracing both with equal vigor. Now, of course, people say embracing it. I heard that before. The problem is, often, especially the owners, try to embrace it, but then they have people who work with them who, let's say, are a bit more critical, who prefer to stay in their space, who prefer to stay in their so-called comfort zone, who prefer to do what they did before. How to overcome this moment where you suddenly have a leader where they say, I have a new idea, but for whatever reason, people don't follow that leader.
Okay, so it's an interesting challenge because you're right. I mean, the majority of people would just sort of, take the low road, which is just do what we've always done, get paid and go home at 4:29 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So one of the ways I've always encouraged my clients and organizations I work with to embrace that idea is to facilitate, instead of a boss coming in and saying, today's new idea is, which already, for most employees is just the death knell, because it just means a new corporate restructure, just moving the chairs around on the Titanic. So what we're trying to do is you actually create a process where the team are involved in the development of the idea. So although it might be the boss's idea, you take them through a process, and often you need an external facilitator to do that gets you to the same outcome that the boss wants in the first place, but through a process of consultation. So you work through with the team. So a classic example of that, I was working with a distribution company, 250 staff. Their product was high value, low volume. So what do I mean by that? They were distributing watches nationally, and so high value but low volume distribution. And I turned around to the board and I said to them, how have you found out if there is a better way of doing your distribution? Have you been into the warehouse to talk to the staff? And so the board looked at me with a look of disgust when I first brought that up. And they said, no, we've got supervisors who's supposed to be giving us ideas and they haven't given us one for months. So I said, well, do me a favor. Take your sandwich lunch. Don't take your fancy lunch. Take it down to the lunchroom where the warehouse staff are eating, and go and sit there and say to them, you're not coming in there to watch them. You genuinely want some feedback. Are there better ways of doing things? Now, they had some better ways, some ideas of improving their systems. But I said, make the effort to just go and talk to the staff. Get their input, because then when you come back to them and say, with all the team's input, we've done X, Y, Z, it's much more palatable to most people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now you might have some people who say, Rael, that's a really good idea, but, and then you might have learned that line, we're a rather conservative industry. I don't think these modern methods work. When I sit down with my workers, they're not going to talk to me, or they're not going to be honest because they are afraid of consequence when they criticize leaders. How do you want to overcome that?
Well, I think that's the role of the facilitator. That's the role of the third party, because often, the third party coming in can do just that. Now, this is not a sales pitch for the facilitators that you and I know all the way around the world who do this for a living. But the reality is, sometimes that third party view, that independent person, I mean, I know with clients that I've worked with, when I go and sit and talk to the staff, they reveal their deep, dark secrets to me that they weren't prepared to tell the boss. Now, they sort of know that the stories are going to get back to the boss, but it's kind of watered down and a bit more anonymous than them telling it. And people are much more open to talking to a third party than they are to their superiors.
So when we talk about this third party facilitator, of course, many people then say we heard of that and we had some bad experiences. And of course, there are great people, and let's face it, there are also not so great people. How can people be sure? Because many leaders are aware that this comes along with a price tag, and they have to justify the cost afterwards. And when afterwards they say the experience wasn't great and neither is the result, they are in deep trouble. How to be sure that I pick the right person?
I mean, I guess, in a world of Google reviews, sometimes, you'd like to think that Google reviews would answer everything. But, it is about, just talking to people. It's so going back to the old-fashioned principles of picking up a phone. Every person I know has referrals. I've been asked, can you give me 5 clients who are happy to talk to me about your work? Well, there's no better way than referral, than being able to confidently say, phone this person, and they will give you the good, the bad, and the ugly of our relationship, and you'll get a good view of it. And, yes, like most people, I get emails once a day in one of my other businesses asking if I've got any negative Google reviews that they want to have removed. So even when you do phone somebody for a reference, so to speak, you still are cautious about the fact that you'll only get the positives. You're not going to tell them, by and large, you're not going to go and say, oh, this person and I had a terrible experience, so phone them.
Yeah, that's true. So when we now talk about the organization and the culture of the organization, one of your keynotes, and you're giving keynotes all over the world, I know you did your own research on organizational culture over several years, and I know that you often present that you present the results of these studies. So when people now think we need to change, and we need to change to, let's say, update our organization. I don't want to spoiler, but are you willing to share with us what are the big trends in organizational culture according to your own research and studies?
Absolutely. So just to put that into context, I was inspired by another speaking friend of mine who lives in Singapore, who said, take my experience out of the countries in which I've lived and worked. And so I've interviewed just under 90 companies now over 25 different countries about what makes their cultures rich and robust. And really, it came down to them, having 2 things. So a lot of companies have mission statements and vision statements, which are nicely framed and stuck on the wall. That's not what it's about.
Often written by a marketing agency where they said, oh, well, we just think of that. Could you just make a couple of nice lines out of that?
Yeah, I on stage, I often use the line that it sounds like the management went up to the mountain, smoked a few joints, and came back with the vision and mission statement. Okay.
Well said. Well said.
And I actually challenge people often off stage, and I go, I can guarantee you, standing here, I can tell every one of you what your vision and mission is. And they look at me like I'm mad, and I go, no, I bet you your values, your mission statement goes something like, we are going to be the best, fill in the blank, in the fill in the blank industry, using the best people, resources, technology, whatever your company does. And that's a pretty standard format. Now, what I've found is 2 key things. Organizations that were successful, and what I mean by success in the culture space is that they have a rich and robust culture, had 2 defining elements, not always both of them, but one or the other, and sometimes both. And the first of those was a set of values that went beyond the organization. Okay. So they had a set of values and they had a set of purposes. So purpose as the first one was something that didn't define what they did. So mission statements, vision, missions and visions tend to be quite specific. A great example is a software company that I was doing some work with, and they had as their purpose statement 3 words: practical, genius, delivered. Every single person in that organization understood that they were part of this thing called practical, genius, delivered. So when I asked the boss to explain it to me, he said, well, it's quite simple. We want to deliver practical solutions that are clever and delivered on time. He said, and every single person, from the cleaner in the building to the lady answering the telephones, to every one of their 120 software engineers and all the support staff, understood that that's what they were doing, delivering practical genius.
Excellent.
And that had nothing to do with, they could be delivering better telescopes or better submarines for that matter. It had nothing to do with what they were delivering, but it had to do with the greater culture of the organization.
That is a very good direction for companies to go for. But, and here I'm coming in now. Now you say we are all about organizational culture, and I think we all agree. No one would say this is not important. On the other hand, many people will now say, look, Rael, we are in a situation with a global pandemic, not easy. I have to make meets and basically the numbers have to at least come to a, let's say, break even at the moment. And here we are with an ethical dilemma. And I know that with your talk, The Ethical X Factor, you talk about ethical dilemmas. So, of course, no one wants to lead by numbers only. Harvard Business Review had a whole edition only focused on how wrong that is, and that many people mix up numbers with strategy. However, we know that when you are the greatest organization on earth and everyone loves to work there, when you don't make at least a profit or a break-even moment, well, the game ends pretty quickly, especially in today's time. So how can I overcome the ethical dilemma, which I have right now often as a business leader, or which I see with business leaders, that on the one hand, they want to create a great organization, but on the other hand, they say, numbers just have to fit what I have to file with the board of directors at the end of the year.
So there are 2 challenges with that. The problem with numbers, let me deal with that one very easily. Not easily. It's never an easy thing to break even, particularly in pandemic times. But the problem with numbers is that they're a lagging indicator of company performance. So the profit today or the sales today may have had a 2-month, 2-year sales cycle. So the activity that's being used, or the measure that's being used, could be a 2-year-old measure to measure current performance. Whereas there are tools around that measure culture and other leading indicators of organizational performance. So you can actually almost put numbers or percentages or relative percentages around culture. So that's why I love culture. It's they say the soft stuff is the hard stuff. Well, this is the soft stuff. That's the hard stuff. In terms of justifying it, I mean, it is much harder in this environment where numerical pressures are on. And some of the time it has to mean that the bosses and the senior management actually are rolling up their sleeves to do stuff that they potentially wouldn't be doing in the corporate office when everyone's there and there's a hierarchical structure. But it comes down to, I think, simplistic management to some degree, is that the purpose, like another one of those purpose statements was a company that said they impacted the lives of those they can impact. Now, I know that sounds like tautology, okay, but impacting the lives of those that they can impact. And they're actually a company that develops drugs for people where there is only about 10,000 cases in the world of that disease. Okay, so impacting the lives of those that can impact. So what does it mean? It means that I think in the current environment, the management role is much more a hands-on role than it's ever been before. It's one of making the call. So right now we're in lockdown, as are most places in the world. So every morning at 9:00, I have with my team in one of my other businesses, we have a "Are you okay?" 10-minute Zoom call, like an agile scrum kind of thing, but it's our daily meeting that we'd have in the kitchen having a cup of coffee. We now have a Zoom call every morning, and all I want to do as the boss is see everyone's face, see what they look like, see how they're going. So I think that touchy-feely stuff is going to get us through the pandemic. It's going to get us through. I mean, there are many industries that have suffered. We know that. And there are many industries that have actually boomed. And so, they face additional challenges of managing growth, of training staff when you can't physically get the staff into your office to train them.
Keep going.
So I think the challenge now is I don't think it's a new challenge. I think the challenge of managing and understanding that you're investing in the future whilst keeping an eye on the past. So you're keeping an eye on your past activity with a belief that going into the future is going to yield you a multiple. Because if you just keep doing the same thing, you go, like Kodak. Kodak went from genius to bankruptcy and then reinvented itself. But it went through the trauma of bankruptcy to reinvent itself. So I'm not suggesting companies go through that. I'm saying I think management for at least the foreseeable future of getting over the global crisis of the pandemic are going to have to become much more people-oriented. People is no longer, and hasn't been for a few years, is no longer the domain of human resources. It's now the domain of everybody.
You are getting to an excellent point here. You now say people focus, and you said that management in these days is a lot more hands-on business. So we need hands-on business people who are able to lead. We need a people-focused approach. And one of your topics is diversity. Climbing to diversity is one of the topics of one of your presentation, one of your keynote speeches. So diversity is important, and I always hear that it's very important. Everyone agrees on it. We have LGBTQIA plus History Month in February. When I look on board level, let's just say the idea of diversity seems to be forgotten as soon as we go up the hierarchical pyramid. And every single time I talk to leaders and say they need to be more diverse, they say, well, we prefer to get someone from the network because they have the experience. And so non-diverse groups of people rehire each other in different places in industry, going, as you said, shuffling around the chairs on the Titanic. How can an organization overcome that circle that the same people keep getting the higher paid and higher level jobs, while at the same time they claim they are very diverse, which they're clearly not? So how can I implement sustainable diversity into an organization which is led by non-diverse people?
Well, So as a male in my 50s, I often joke about myself being pale, male, and stale. And that is the problem, is that the boards of directors of many large corporates are my contemporaries and those 10 years older than me. And so generationally, that is unfortunately the legacy. The problem with diversity, and a great friend of mine actually also who inspired me to generate the keynote on diversity, is a diversity speaker here in Australia. And her and I were talking about it, and she actually does a keynote that says you can't have diversity without inclusion. And she said it's okay. And she says the problems of a place like South Africa right now, where they've got forced diversity quotas, not a bad thing, because it has forced people to do that. And in Australia, there are many moves to have 30% women representation across every level of the organization, including boards. Now, it should be 50, but it isn't. But 30 is, a much bigger number than it is right now. And that's a target for most companies to at least try and achieve that. But what the point is you can have the diversity, but you have to have the inclusion. And that's been the problem, is that the average board consisting of, pale male and stale men, inclusion for them is another pale male and stale person. So how do you get diversity? I mean, I think it does require vision. It requires a purpose. It requires a board who's prepared to go out on a limb, to be challenged. I mean, I'm known in all the boards I've ever been on as someone who challenges. I have a philosophy of seeking forgiveness and not permission.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what it requires. It requires organizations to be bold enough. Now, in the large listed companies, if they brought people in who challenged the board, what happens on the board stays on the board. So it's not like it's going public. It's not like it's in the public domain. And really, you'd like to think that the next generation of management, and unfortunately, I don't think we have another generation to wait.
Mm-hmm.
The next generation of management will need to be much more accepting and much more open to diversity, whether it be, gender-based, whether it be orientation-based, and whether it's color-based. I mean, depending, all three of those come into the diversity mix. But all three of those areas, and there will be a whole lot more areas for diversity, really need to be embraced, because it does require vision, and it requires, and it's interesting, it's opening eyes. A great friend of ours from America, a well-known speaker, friend of ours from America, tells a beautiful story about how she, as a Black woman, spoke at a conference of predominantly right-wing South Africans, and how a couple of the people were in tears at the end of her talk, because her hour or two that she'd spent with them so moved them from their position of historical vilification of people who of other races to a position of going, wow, what have we missed out on?
I think,
and so you need more voices for that. That's what it is. I mean, you need more voices. You need speakers like you and I and others that we know out there, educating people on just embracing change, because it's the same as culture. Cultures need to embrace change. The accounting firm, I interviewed them, that runs the MyOb software. They revisit their culture and their value set every 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually have a formal process every 3 years, or 2.5, so that it's available every third year, of actually looking at what does the company stand for, who is in the company, are we in the countries we're working, are we employing local people, are we employing diverse local people in the countries in which we're working, and do those people understand our value set? And if not, have our values changed over the last 3 years, and how do we move them along?
Excellent. I think these are perfect final words for this podcast. I of course will put your contact data in the show notes of this podcast so people can get in touch with you directly. At the end of this podcast, there's only one thing for me left to say. Rael, thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Niels, and thank you for inviting me on your podcast.